right. Hey, folks. I am Jeffrey Matthias. Uh, my pronouns are he and him. I can be found on Twitter at idlehands. And I'm also known as one of the co-authors of the recent book from Pragmatic Programmers called Testing Elixir. Wrote it with Andrea Leopardi, otherwise known as What You Hide. He's an Elixir core team member, and he and I have worked together for over 3 years now. We formed a bond over testing, and I talked him into writing a book with me. These days, we're also working at community.com. It's a place where we're trying to remove some of the toxicity in the internet. We're giving people with a fan base, whether it's a musician, a web personality, influencer, or companies, access to the ability to interact directly with their followers or their fans through text messaging, so that they're not performing for other people. There's no algorithms getting in the way of what content is shared. So today we're going to be talking about writing maintainable test factories. The structure of the talk is, first we're going to cover what a factory is and what it's not, what other options are besides what I'm proposing today, or besides using factories, specifically how I write factories, rules that you should get into, or the rules that you should definitely follow, kind of where I'll be taking this next, things that I've been playing around with behind the scenes and you probably should not try yet. And then we'll end up with some time for questions. So the first thing is just, what is a factory? Initially, the term factory comes from the Java Gang of Four factory pattern. It has evolved significantly since it was originally made. That was basically code that would generate a pre-made instance of something with specific attributes without ever actually calling new on that thing itself. The fact, but that's object oriented ideas. Eventually, I think with Ruby, we saw thoughtbots, factorybot kind of pushing it towards just, it's a thing that just builds data to throw into your database. And it's become more and more of a generic term just to mean like, this is the thing that's building out test data for us. It still has an association with putting it in the database, but I'm going to try and get us to push that even a little bit further today, stretch the definition even further. And so it's more kind of thinking about how, a car factory keeps putting out many versions of the same car, but then there's just slight differences basically, and that's effectively what the approach that we're going to be taking with these. I want to make a big caveat before I do anything else, that I rely pretty heavily on a package from Thoughtbot called ExMachina, but the majority of what I'm presenting today, while I use that to add conveniences, just about everything I'll be talking about today applies to any can be used with or without ExMachina. As I mentioned, I use it just because I'm convenient. Every time I continue to write my own, I keep finding I'm throwing in more and more stuff that they've got covered there. And so even though I'm not in love with the API, that tends to be my approach. So in our case, again, this is code that's designed to throw in data for your tests to stage the data that you need. And so what are the other options? One is using your own code, right? Calling your own production code. So for example, if your test needs a user, calling your own user creation code. And one of the there's a couple reasons I tend to steer away from that approach. The first one is that a lot of times we want to stage data where something maybe has existed for a while, right? So if we've got a user, but it needs to be in a specific condition, we potentially have to run through a bunch of different functions, kind of updating and creating a bunch of things. And that in itself gets to be pretty distracting from the setup. It takes away from what we're doing, and it doesn't necessarily provide the level of documentation that we would hope it would, because it doesn't actually describe the state of the data, but how it got there, or how you got to get the state, how the state of the data got to be what it is, but not what the actual state is. And I really, really like my test to describe as documentation, I like them to describe what the state of the data is. Another side to that too is that there's plenty of times where I'm focusing on running just a small batch of tests, and then I step back and I'll run my whole suite. And if you're focusing on the code that is doing that user creation or whatever it is that you were leveraging in other tests, there's a possibility that you've changed the way it behaves, and it was good for those purposes, but the tests themselves, you actually can blow up a bunch of your test suite. I don't have a high tolerance for having to then figure out where I've done that. If if you immediately made a change and things started breaking, it's great. You can figure out where there are issues, but I tend to just steer away from it altogether. The other style of approaching setting up test data is fixtures, and that means either it's a file that just has a static database dump that can just be loaded in as part of the testing suite, or seed files that go through. And the reason I tend to steer away from those, as I mentioned before, I like my test to be documentation about whatever that test is doing. It's trying to tell me what my application is doing. And when you're using fixture files like that, one of the pro sides is it gives you the ability to be very curated and very intentional for the whole application suite on what the data looks like. And I appreciate that. But every test that's using the data from those fixtures actually has to have implicit knowledge, and it's not clear reading. That goes back to the thing, my issue with the other one, where I really like my test to be able to explain what the state of the data is, or what the conditions of the data are, the conditions in which the tests are occurring. And so I push pretty hard to use factories and treat them not just as a way to insert data in the database, but actually your entire test suite's reference for how the data itself should be created or shaped. And so what I do in the applications that I'm working on is I create something called a template, factory template. And inside of that, we've got a using macro, right? So then that means that anytime you were actually to create a factory inside of your application, you would say, inside of that factory, you would say, and I'll show an example of what that looks like in a minute. Use my app, factory template. And so you'll notice in my case, as I mentioned, I typically do use ExMachina. Not a requirement. Again, it just means that you need to come up with another way to do the similar kind of functionality. But then one of the major things I mentioned, it's not just for creating things in the database, but I also use this as my centralized definition of what kinds of how to generate valid values for different kinds of data types. And so anything that's using this template is going to inherit, and we typically have a lot more data types built out. But it's going to, I said inherit, please forgive that. I recognize we're working in, we're not working in object-oriented code. Not sure where that came from. But anyway, it's going to have these functions that are centralized. So we've got a single definition, but each of our different factories will be leveraging these, right? And so the big advantage to this is that at some point, and this has happened plenty of times there, after a year of using data or setting up data one way. An example on line 10, we've got HTTPS. Originally, for a long time, a lot of the URLs I was using in testing were HTTP, right? And so just by having a centralized place where if I just needed a random URL, I could switch it and update my entire test suite so that all the URLs that were being generated, since they were all drawing from this same single definition, suddenly became updated. In fact, that would be an opportune way to find out if some of your tests were actually failing, specifically because which is an opportunity or a place where you would have needed to update from HTTP to HTTPS anyhow. You'll also notice that we're using Faker in this code. Faker is a library that I often lean on to create data, but fake data. But again, it's the whole idea is that I can switch, with this pattern, we can switch up the way that all of that data type throughout our entire test suite is being generated. On line 12, there's also, we're leveraging that thing that says sequence. That is from ExMachina. That's one of those conveniences that I realize, that I find myself often doing. So this is just for basic data types or generic things. And then often you can end up with, it also gives you the ability to do stuff that is more application specific, right? Like in our case, I know exactly what fields we need for address stuff. We'll focus on that. So it's beyond just basic data types there. And then on top of that, like the applications I've worked with in the last couple of years have both used ecto-enum, the library ecto-enum, and also the ecto.enum, which is now recently introduced in newer versions of ecto. And so I've got two different functions where I can pass it the either a schema or a name or the enum itself, depending on which type it is, and actually just get one of those random values back. So this gives us the ability to build out valid data for these things without necessarily without having to hard code it ahead of time. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that's important in just a minute. So I mentioned we'd go over how you use that. Before I dive into this, I should call out one of the ways that I push people to think about application design when they're designing their application context. And I know that contexts are something that are still people are still struggling to understand. But when you build out a context, it should be about how how the code should be grouped by how it needs to be used or who's using it. And so a lot of times you'll end up with a place where multiple contexts will be using the same database table. I really strongly urge people to consider having multiple ecto schema definitions, one per context, and using it specifically just to be the window that context needs to that table, so that there are fields, if there are fields that an admin should only ever see and a user should never see on their own, on that user's data, the context that the user has access to should that schema should never even have those fields defined on it. And so what that means in this case then is that I'm pushing for a factory to be created per context. And so that's why we have the factory template, and that's why you would potentially have more than one factory inside of your application. And so once that's done, so in this particular case, we would have, this is the example context because I was being very clever with the naming when I was working on these on the sample code. But in this particular case, then these are going to be, if you see on line 4, well, first off, we're using the factory template, as I mentioned earlier. And then on line 4, we've got, it's using specifically the versions of the schema for this context. And then so when it's generating data, whether it's getting stuck in the database or it's getting stuck in the or it's getting stuck, or if it's just returning code that's in memory, it's going to be the versions of the schemas that are specific to the context that we're testing against. And so one of the things that I've done, and this is going a little bit further or above and beyond, and this I absolutely qualifies. In previous versions of this talk, I actually I was considering this to be kind of the don't try this at home, the experimental stuff. But we've been trying it long enough, and people haven't been burned by it yet. In fact, found it to be a good match to this whole idea of a factory per context, that I've thrown this code into the beginning of our data case and our controller, or our con case, where it allows you, and I'll show how it's used in just a minute. It allows you to actually pass in an additional option called context, and then that just goes and it'll hit up another module we have where each context name is then mapped to the correct factory. And then when we're calling use on the data case, it then aliases factory to be the correct factory for that context. And so at the very bottom here, you can see if you were writing a test, you would actually say use my app data case, and then it's got this pass through, which normally you wouldn't be passing options to it. And it just sets that. And that means that anytime anything in this test then can just refer to factory as to get the correct factory. And that's actually really handy, because one of the things that I've discovered as I'm building out context and as we're working on that architecture is sometimes you're not entirely sure where code belongs. And one of the solutions there is actually to build a new context. And then eventually, when you've got stuff going, you're going to have more context built out than you necessarily want, but it's a lot easier to pull or combine contexts and narrow them down than it is to try to prize them apart, because you realize you built the wrong associations, or you put code together didn't belong. I think of it as like when my kids are smashing two colors of Play-Doh together, it's always way easier for them to smash the Play-Doh together and turn it into a ball than it is for them to ever separate it again. And so it's the same idea with this, but so by having this kind of generic factory in there, it actually reduces the amount of search and replace or finding things that you have to do to clean up. If you're actually, when you move the tests over, you end up, the test will actually continue to work. You just have to just change the context is at the top if you're combining contexts. And so that's actually just the basic. By the way, all this code, all the sample code I'm showing here, I will be providing links. It's just sitting in a gist available for folks, so we'll be able to cover that at the end. And so that's all how I make my factories. And it is a major component to them being maintainable over a long period of time. And in fact, I should have discussed this earlier. One of the biggest challenges to no matter what strategy you take to create your test data, within 2 years or a year or however, whenever your application makes that shift from being greenfield to legacy, that's about when you start realizing or start hating all the decisions you've made with things, right? And regretting it. And things are, every time you want to make changes, you've got to go through nested refactors to untangle stuff. And one of the biggest challenges when you're using the factory approach to things is that people will, because we tend to try and reuse code, we've got this has been beaten, don't repeat yourself has been kind of beaten into our heads over and over for a lot of our careers. We tend to keep using the same setup code, but for more and more situations. If you recall, I was saying, I was hinting earlier that your tests are going to require different data setup, and I want that to be shown in the tests themselves. One of the major rules, in fact, I'm going to go over a couple rules here. These, if you take nothing else away from this talk, these are the things I want you to think about. And just like every rule, if once you feel like you've got a really good grasp on them and why these rules exist, that is the only time I suggest really like finding or taking it as acceptable to start breaking them, or find exceptions where you don't need to necessarily follow them as stringently. But the biggest thing, and it's been on the screen for a while, so you probably know where I'm going, is don't nest the creation of resources inside of other resources. It seems really, really straightforward. Like sometimes it should be obvious, like, well, why can't, if a user is the only thing with an address, why is this problematic? Well, maybe a user isn't the only thing that ends up with an address, or maybe address ends up actually having a nested resource under it. And at some point, you're starting to build in all these assumptions about what the data looks like in a way that then again, somewhere else, when you're trying to reuse that same part of your factory, that same code to generate data, you're in a position where you don't necessarily have the same dependencies or the same decisions that need to be made. And suddenly you're in a conflict. One of the biggest, and that actually is, I think, the biggest place we end up with problems when we're working 2 years into an application, is that it's all of the hidden things, all the implicit behavior, right? Part of the reason a lot of at least for me, part of the reason I love working in Elixir is all the explicit stuff that we have to do. That's part of the reason why when I was showing you that code before, I wasn't automatically, identifying what context you're in. I was making it pass and explicit. I like explicit. It usually takes just a little bit of extra code and it takes away a lot of the mystery, right? Well, in this particular case, it's really easy to keep building out into the implicit the world of implicit, and the more implicit things we have, the harder it is to maintain in the future. So I go and discover that this one assumption has been made about how the data should be shaped when it was appropriate for whoever made that original factory. We've been reusing this thing. It's been nested 3 layers deep, and now suddenly it's causing me a problem. And so the other thing is, if you're really in a place where you find that you've got to keep that not nesting data, but building it instead in your test and passing it in as an override is problematic, it may, and I just say may, be a sign that your data is structured in a hard to deal with or hard to reason about way anyway. And it might be a hint, a test smell, if you will, when your tests are telling you actually something about your production code or your design. It may be a test smell suggesting that you should be looking at a different way of structuring things. If you find that you keep having to do the same thing over and over again for, let's say in a set of tests, that's where setups come up. The setup block comes up, or setup functions, right? But I still highly suggest you keep those in the single test file. Don't try to keep making these generic broad tools that will work for all of the different scenarios, because you're just going to end up putting yourself right back into the whole context that we are avoiding by trying to do things explicitly and passing in those nested resources in the first place. And again, the other thing is that will help if you can keep it all within the same test. It helps your test still stay as documentation on what the state of data looks like for the conditions in which the test is acting or is happening. The next one, and this ties in pretty closely, is understanding the difference between intentional and incidental data. This is I believe there's an appendix at the end of our book where I tried to dive into this. Anything that will impact the behavior of your code is intentional data. It's code that needs to be set intentionally, basically, right? It has to be set a certain way. Anything that shouldn't impact that, and a lot of times, especially when we're dealing with building out resources that go in the database, if I'm working on something that has to do with date of birth, the first name of that user is totally unimportant to me, right? And so anything that's unimportant, that should not impact the behavior of your code, that is incidental data. I highly encourage, and this is one of the places where the factories come in really handy, and I said I'd talk about this earlier, I highly encourage people to randomize their incidental data. For one thing, it actually helps the test document. In this particular case, we're looking at this test setup. I can tell just reading this test that the only part of the data on the user that's important for this test, that's intentional, is the date of birth. Everything else is incidental. I don't have to worry about it. That doesn't mean I don't have to test against it. It means that I don't need to worry about the specific value of it, right? So it may be that I still need to, if part of what I'm testing is a side effect or a return value, and I need to see that randomized data is still there, that's fine. I will just reference the data on the user that we're setting here, right? But I don't need to worry about the explicit value. I can call user.firstname in my assertions, and I don't ever have to care what the value is. It was randomly set by my factory, and I move on. The one thing I have to pay attention to in the way that this test is acting as documentation, it says, hey, in the condition where my date of birth is nil, then there should be this extra, or the behavior of the code under test should be whatever these assertions are showing. And so this ties back in with the avoiding nesting of things, because ultimately it's very possible that you have intentional data on that nested thing that can impact the behavior. And we have a tendency to then, because it's nested, there often tends to be a tendency with developers to make the default value on that nested thing be the intentional data. And that is one of the major places where we end up getting ourselves into a rat's nest of dependencies or mistakes or problems that we don't understand, and causes us to start hating our factories in the future. And so at the end of the day, that is the majority of the content I was going to cover. I'm going to kind of run through the last things pretty quickly. The next things I'm going to do in the future, I'll probably put out a factory template package so that it's just with overwritable stuff, so that it's easier for people just to get started, and it'll have the basic data types. I'm going to probably look at restricting and with that factory templates package, the next stop would be preventing the use of build and insert with it from within the factory itself. And then I don't know if I'll try to come up with a simpler version of like the actual factory code itself, or just continue to work with ExMachina as a dependency. I promise don't do it at home, or don't try this at home. This ties in with a bigger pattern that I'll come out with blog posts about sometime soon. But when we're working on our schema tests, we actually have the fields and the types locked down, and that's to prevent regressions. But once you have that, that also gives you the ability inside of your own test to refer to that. And so I've got, in one of our applications, we've been playing around with functions that basically, if you handed a map like this and you say, hey, give me valid params, it's got little function generators or generator functions, and it'll actually hand back that. And inversely, we also have the same thing. So if you want to try to test out cast validations and make sure that they're present on everything, that you can actually produce automatically invalid parameters for those types as well. So, and then, sorry, that's just the last part. Actually, no, this code is not included with what I'm handing out because I don't want you to try it at home. So as a wrap up on the talk, I want to throw a big thanks out to Brooklyn Myers, who on a previous version of this, when I was kind of trying out the whole idea at, I think it was the DC Elixir meetup, took awesome notes and wrote a great blog post on it, which I totally cheated and used to help get the content together for this talk. I want to thank Jeff Smith, for one of my coworkers and good friends, for being a constant guinea pig and giving me really good feedback on patterns like this. And I want to thank community.com for just being overall supportive. They gave me time off to work on the book and have been just a huge supporter. They sent me to the actual physical conference this week so I could be present and kind of, network a bit and stuff. Community has just been an awesome place to work, and I appreciate it. So one last thing, I'm going to try something new. You're hearing it here first. I now have an email address, help@testingelixir.com. If you want help with testing, you can write me there and I will write you back. And as long as it's doesn't turn out to be totally overwhelming, I will continue to just provide support to anybody who wants help writing good tests in Elixir. The last thing is, I mentioned that the code would be available. Both this email address and everything I talked about that I thought you should be having a hold of is available at bit.ly/maintainable F factories.